Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations. We've all been witnessing a strange defense of the Second Vatican non-binding pastoral council in the last few weeks. There's a meme being pushed by the defenders of Vatican II that the council was a wild success, that the council is still being implemented, and if it wasn't for the council, the Catholic Church would have been largely consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm not sure which of the narratives is more personally offensive, but these are all a sign of some kind of desperation. And why? It's not only the council and pushback against the council that's been happening for many years at this point. It's the Synod on Synodality, which is a de facto Third Vatican Council, a statement that gets me some pushback, and that's fine, but I'm not the only one saying it. But this synod is being used in place of a council to achieve what a council would promote. And the synod is a failure already, given that its legitimacy is being grounded on the participation of the laity in the process. This is sort of a democratization of the church. And the thing is, almost no one participated in it. So let's look at these stories because they cannot be ignored anymore. So let's start with one of the cardinals running the Synod on Synodality, Cardinal Hollerich. From Catholic News Agency, we get this headline. Cardinal Hollerich. Without Vatican II, the church today would be a small sect. No, it wouldn't. We've seen seminarian numbers collapse starting immediately after the council. We've seen the numbers of young men and women religious collapse after Vatican II. Everything was on an upward trajectory until the close of the council. And then what? Catholics left in large numbers for various other groups. In America, it was for evangelical Christianity. I'm not sure where Catholics left for in Europe and beyond. Let me know if you know, though. But let's give Cardinal Hollerich his due to make his argument, out of respect for the office that he allegedly holds. From the article, quote, Cardinal Jean Hollerich, the Relator General of the Synod on Synodality, has said that he is convinced that the Second Vatican Council saved the Church. If we did not have that point of reform, that was the Second Vatican Council, the Church today would be a small sect, unknown to most people, Hollerich said in an interview with the Spanish news outlet Vida Nueva, published on October 17th. The Archbishop of Luxembourg added that he believes that if Vatican II had not taken place, the Church would have been reduced to a group that performs beautiful rites, but that nobody knows anything about. Today, we must adapt to the changing mindsets. People are still interested in the gospel, and we must rediscover the authenticity of being true disciples of Jesus, he said. End quote. He then goes on to repeat tired claims that the traditionalist movement is a postmodern movement, which is an odd claim to make and would take an entire video to explain what he means by that. For our purposes, we'll just say that it's wrong and it reeks of the pot calling the kettle black. But this is a pretty consistent theme we're seeing right now, that the Church, whose ecclesiology, theology, liturgy, devotions, and approach to the world withstood countless tyrants, the Protestant revolt, and even the upheavals of the two wars of the 20th century, suddenly couldn't survive a sudden age of decadence and materialism. That's seriously the claim they're making. That's their argument. It's a sad argument, to be sure, but even if it were true, so what? If the faith is true, then why do we need to water down or even reject the truth so that a world that's re-embraced pagan living will be nice to the Church? They certainly haven't come into the Church, so what's the point? No one's really been able to explain that to me in a satisfactory manner, and I've been waiting. I'm all ears. Give me a good explanation. Cardinal Hollerich isn't the only one saying this stuff lately, though. George Weigel wants us to know that Vatican II was necessary. I doubt Mr. Weigel would ever consider himself to be on the same side as Cardinal Hollerich on much of anything. On most things of the time, Mr. Weigel is too sensible to side with a radical modernist like Hollerich, but in this case he's basically on the same side as Cardinal Hollerich. Headline from Catholic World Report: Why Vatican II was necessary. The Church's pre-conciliar proclamation and apologetics were strong on logic, but a world become irreligious was not, in the main, going to be converted by logical demonstrations. So in other words, the Church before the Council was right on paper, and its reasoning before the council, but because the world got emotional and illogical after the war, we needed to become emotional and illogical ourselves. Does that make any sense to you? Well, let's get the thrust of Mr. Weigel's argument in his own words. Hint, you're not going to see anything new here. Quote, in the years immediately after the council, Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, who was one of the three most influential theologians at Vatican II, knew that the council's reception was imperfect, and its implementation even more imperfect. Nonetheless, he identified further reasons why Vatican II was necessary, and why its teaching was essential for the Church's life going forward. Quoting then Father Ratzinger, the council reinserted into the Church as a whole a doctrine of papal primacy that was dangerously isolated. It integrated into the one mysterium of the body of Christ a too isolated conception of the hierarchy. It restored to the ordered unity of faith an isolated Mariology. It gave the biblical word its full due. It made the liturgy once more accessible. And, in addition, it made a courageous step forward toward the unity of all Christians. Thus, the Council had many theological and doctrinal accomplishments to its credit. These were crucial to rekindling that radical, Christ-centered faith that would be the source of a revitalized Catholic mission to convert the modern world. Similarly, the Council's rejection of Catholic triumphalism was good in itself and necessary for its mission. Quoting Ratzinger again, it was both necessary and good for the Council to put an end to the false forms of the Church's glorification of self on earth, and by suppressing her compulsive tendency to defend her past history, to eliminate her false justification of self. End quote. Mr. Weigel is doing the work of those who like to remind us that Father Ratzinger was involved in all of this himself. And all the points they're making here are wrong. Look, I respect Mr. Weigel for his contributions in fighting for the Church against her secular adversaries. I do. Catholic triumphalism is a slander that refuses to recognize that the Church has the fullness of the truth, that the Church was established by Christ, outside of which there is no salvation. To bring up her past is usually something done by her adversaries in a distorted manner. Call it triumphalist if you like. I call it hard but true teaching that should motivate all of us to spread the gospel. Plus the idea that either the Mariology of the Church or the Church's handling of the Bible was insufficient prior to the Council is just too much to even consider. If you do a scriptural analysis of the traditional Latin Mass, you will find that the Mass is rich with biblical moorings, and you always got indulgences to reading Scripture every day. But what Mr. Weigel is doing here is repeating the party line about Vatican II, that it was necessary and good for the Church, even if the data in the real world simply doesn't back that claim up. A simple example of this comes from, well, anywhere in the Western world, really. Chicago in the U.S. is most notorious for this, and Germany is making headlines all the time. And what are they doing? They're closing the majority of their parishes and consolidating them into larger, fewer, more distant parishes from one another. In the U.S., we have the story of Steubenville, where the diocese is getting merged with a neighboring diocese due to falling numbers of Catholics. From Pillar Catholic, we get the headline, Steubenville Diocese to face merger with neighbor Columbus Diocese. The Catholic diocese is expected to announce that a merger process with another Ohio diocese is underway. That story was published on October 10th, and before anyone asks, yes, that is the same Steubenville that is home to the famous Franciscan University where Scott Hahn is a fixture, as is the famous or infamous Steubenville Youth Conferences. That diocese is being merged with Columbus, pending approval by the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and I see no reason why they won't approve it. These things are happening all over the Western world. And why? Because the Council was a mistake. That's why. The so-called reforms of the modernists were a catastrophic error pushed by ideologues who had no respect for the faith, no respect for the teachings and history of the Church. Many of them wanted to change the Church for their own purposes. They wanted to remake Catholicism, which has been an ongoing project of theirs since the Council, and continues today in the Synod on Synodality. And yes, we can place this on Vatican II. About 6 weeks ago, Catholic World Report published this article. Headline, Anatomist of the Catholic Collapse in France and Beyond. Few scholars have studied the extent, causes, and effects of the mid to late 20th century collapse of Western Catholicism more carefully than French historian Guillaume Couchet. My apologies for my pronunciation of his name. I looked up how to do it, My brain understood how to do it, my tongue did not want to comply. I'm sure the more charitable among you can sympathize. Anyway, from the article, quote, Couchet, once again relying on the late 1960s work of Canon Boulard and others, shows that the collapse of practice among Catholics in France dates to 3 years before 1968, very precisely to the year 1965. He calls it, quote, the year of the drop-off, or of the collapse. As Couchet points out, this reality puzzled Boulard and the bishops he reported to at the time of, quote, ideological sanctuarization of the Second Vatican Council. Although by then the bishops who could unconsciously sense that certain hopes had been misplaced were no longer interested in such quantitative studies. In fact, Boulard continued his research at the university and carried on until his death in 1977. Couchet had access to some of his correspondence and interlocutors from the period of 1965 to 1977. After a time, it did dawn on Boulard that something drastic had happened. End quote. Then, as now, the prelates were not interested in data that contradicted what was being said about the council and its effects from the hierarchy. But here's a couple of handy charts to make it all the more clear. You can see the number of seminarians was growing rapidly from 1920 until 1965, when suddenly, out of the blue, the numbers cratered. And they cratered in 1965. What happened? 1965 was the year the council closed. That's when things collapsed. And some of the modernists try to say, well, the church backed off on the idea of married priests, so yay. People could say you don't have the faith if you point obvious things like this out. They can deny it all they want. But here's the truth. I could go on, but I'm not going to. Just get ready for more of this, because Cardinal Hollerich and others who have hitched their wagons to the legitimacy of the greatness and need of Vatican II will continue to defend the Council at all costs. And they do it at least in part because the Synod on Synodality is a continuation of Vatican II, and functionally is a Third Vatican Council, regardless of what any modernist apologist may otherwise say about it. We are constantly being told that the Church needs to change as part of the excuse for the Synod. And now we're being reminded of the legitimacy of that other great moment of change in the Church, Vatican II. But you already know what I think, so I'm curious about what you have to say about this in the comments, please. So let me know what you think about all this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't, it really does help. Share this on social media if you can. That helps enormously as well. As always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.